He conquered 7 kingdoms. He never lost a war. And tonight, King Draven Voss leads his own mate to the sacrificial altar, believing her death will save his empire. But here's what no one in that throne room knows. The woman walking calmly toward her execution is not just his mate. She is something ancient, something the empire forgot how to fear. Stay until the end, because the moment everything breaks open will hit you somewhere deep. Drop your city in the comments right now, hit that like, and do not look away. This story is only beginning. The crows came 3 days before the announcement, not 1 or 2 circling the imperial spire the way they sometimes did after a battle, picking clean what war left behind. Hundreds of them. Black against the pale dawn sky, like a wound that refused to close, wheeling above the palace of Veyrath in silence so complete that even the sentries on the outer walls stopped their rounds and stood watching with that particular stillness men wear when they sense something larger than themselves moving through the world. Seraphine Vale noticed them from her window before the palace woke. She stood in her sleeping clothes with her bare feet against the cold stone floor, a cup of tea going cold in both hands, and watched the birds circle. Her dark hair was loose across her shoulders. There was a bruise at the inside of her left wrist, faint as a memory, from where she had gripped the stone balustrade too hard the night before during one of her dreams. Silver temples, voices like bells underwater, a crown too heavy to hold without bleeding. She had learned not to speak about the dreams. She had learned, in the 4 years since she arrived at this court, to keep most of what she observed behind her eyes. The crows circled until the sun broke the eastern ridgeline. Then they landed on the spire roof, every one of them, and sat in silence. That was the first sign. She did not know yet it was also a warning. What? The imperial court of Veyrath occupied 4 floors of the palace's eastern wing, a structure of black stone and silver-veined marble that Draven's grandfather had built to intimidate foreign dignitaries before they ever reached the throne room. It worked. Seraphine had watched envoys from 3 kingdoms lose their composure walking through that corridor for the first time. The ceilings were vaulted so high that sound died before it could echo back, and the portraits of dead Voss kings on the walls had been painted at a scale that made any living person feel approximate, a rough sketch of something permanent. She had stopped feeling approximate in this place sometime around the end of her 2nd year. She moved through the morning court without escort, as she preferred, nodding to the lesser lords who parted for her with the specific combination of deference and hunger that titled men showed toward women they could not categorize. She was the king's mate. She had no official title of her own. She held no seat on the imperial council. She gave no orders and commanded no armies. And yet she had survived 4 years inside the most politically lethal court in the known empire, which was itself a form of power that the ambitious men around her could not quantify and therefore could not stop being unsettled by. She found Lord Chancellor Valor Thorn near the council chamber doors, speaking in a low voice to 2 of the high priests. She did not break stride. She passed close enough to catch 3 words: altar, purified, blood, and filed them somewhere beneath the part of her face that showed anything. Valor glanced up and saw her. He was a man who wore stillness like armor, wide-shouldered and iron-haired, with eyes the pale yellow of a predator who had learned to be patient. He had served 3 kings. He was, by every visible measure, the 2nd most powerful entity in Veyrath, and he wore that proximity to power with the particular ease of a man who had decided, long ago, that patience was simply a longer form of conquest. He smiled at her. "Lady Vale." His voice was warm. It was always warm. That warmth was, she had decided, the single most dangerous thing about him. "You look troubled this morning." "I look cold," she said. The eastern windows were left open again. "Someone should speak to the chamberlain." His smile did not move. "Of course." She walked past him and did not look back. Inside her chest, something old and nameless pressed against her ribs like a fist. Said. Draven was in the war room. He was almost always in the war room now. She pushed the door open without knocking. She was the only person in the palace who did this and remained alive, and found him standing over the campaign table with his hands braced flat against the northern province's map, his back to her, his shoulders carrying that specific tension she had learned to read the way sailors read weather. Dark hair, close-cropped, a body built by 20 years of combat that had not softened even now that the wars were technically over. The scar that ran from his left ear down the side of his throat was pale in the morning light. General Aldrich stood to his left. 2 council advisors flanked the right side of the table. They all looked up when she entered. Draven did not. The Thornwood province sent another report, Aldrich said, not quite to her, but not quite not. The frost reached the grain stores, 3rd one this season. The river at Caldenmere is black from bank to bank. Fishing villages have been abandoned. I know, Draven said. His voice was lower than it had been a year ago, not quieter. Lower. Like something pressed down from above. I read the same report. There are 9 more like it, one of the advisors said. Silence. Seraphine crossed the room and looked at the map herself. The black marks indicating plague zones spread across the northern and eastern provinces like spilled ink. She had been watching this map for months. The spread was not random. It had a shape. She could almost see it, the way you could almost see the pattern in static if you stared long enough. But every time she reached for it, it slipped away. Draven, she said. He turned then. His eyes found hers immediately, the way they always did, some automatic calibration. And for a moment she saw the man underneath the king's exhaustion. The particular bleakness of someone who had spent years being strong enough for everyone around him and had started to wonder what that cost. You heard, he said. About the Thornwood? Yes. About the council meeting this afternoon. She looked at him steadily. No. He turned back to the map. Then come. The Imperial Council chamber was a circular room. Seraphine had always thought this was intentional. No head of the table, theoretically equal voices, the architecture of consensus. In practice, everyone in the room knew where Draven stood and arranged their bodies relative to that point whether they acknowledged it or not. She took her customary position to his right, 1 step behind, the exact location that made certain council members' eyes do that involuntary flick, checking her, recalibrating, reminding themselves she was just the mate, no formal authority, nothing to fear. And she stood there looking calm while the chief astrologer presented his findings. The man's name was Elder Carveth, 80 years old and built like something carved from old wood, voice steady as a siege engine. He had been observing the celestial blight for 7 months. He had consulted every text in the Imperial Archive. He had traveled personally to the sacred abyss on the Empire's southern border. He unrolled his documents on the council table. The blight, he said, is celestial in origin. The moon's governing power over the wolf bloodlines has been disrupted at a fundamental level. Our wolves lose their shifts because the old covenant is breaking. The crops die because the frost that falls is not natural frost. It carries the signature of severed celestial connection. He paused. His old eyes moved across the room. The Empire is being withdrawn from. By what? Lord Castellandre asked. By the moon herself. Silence. The ancient texts, Carveth continued, describe only one method by which the celestial covenant was restored in the age before written history, a royal blood sacrifice performed beneath the blood moon. The offering must be a person bound by sacred bond to the ruling bloodline. He looked at his documents. He did not look at Seraphine. A mate. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Seraphine felt the ring spreading outward from it. She did not move. She tracked every face around the table in her peripheral vision without moving her head. The way she had learned to do, the way you learned when you spent years watching rooms that could turn on you. And she saw what each man's face showed in the 2 seconds before they schooled it into blankness. Valor Thorn showed nothing at all. He had always been ready. Draven's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered beneath his left eye. His hand, still braced against the table, pressed flat with a pressure that blanched his knuckles. Then he said, very carefully, "How certain are you?" "The texts are clear," Carveth said. "The blood moon rises in 8 days." I asked how certain you are. "The evidence is..." "How?" Draven's voice had gone flat. The flatness that meant something behind his eyes had made a decision and was currently demolishing everything in its path to reach acceptance. "Certain." Carveth held his gaze. "Entirely." The silence that followed had a texture. She could feel it on her skin. Then Valor spoke gently, like a man who had not spent 3 years engineering this exact moment. The Empire is 20 million souls, my king. Your mate is one. The mathematics of sacrifice have always been brutal. That is why it falls to kings and not to lesser men to perform them. Seraphine turned her head and looked at Valor directly. He met her eyes. His face was the face of a man who grieved. It was a perfect performance. She had seen it before, smaller scale, lower stakes, and now she understood what it had been practiced for. I will consider the council's counsel, Draven said. He left the chamber. She stood still for exactly 3 more seconds, long enough that leaving immediately would not read as following, and then she followed him. Tack. He was in the corridor that led to his private study. He was moving fast, the controlled fast of a man who did not run because running would mean he was afraid, and he had not been afraid in a very long time. Draven. He stopped. She came around to face him. This close, she could see the fracture lines in his control, the tight set of his mouth, the slight elevation in his breathing, the way his hands had curled at his sides without quite becoming fists. Say it, she said. There's nothing to say yet. I haven't made a decision. You've made the decision. You're trying to find a way not to have made it. His eyes cut to hers. That particular look, the one that said she saw him more clearly than he was comfortable with, and they both knew it. It might not be the only option, he said. I'm going to have other scholars review Carveth's. His evidence was thorough. You have no idea whether his evidence was thorough. You heard 7 minutes of a 7-month analysis. I know what a man looks like when he's been up 3 nights building a case he believes. Carveth believes it. That doesn't make him right, but it means his conviction is genuine. Draven stared at her. Something moved in his face that she could not name. Don't, he said quietly. Don't what? Don't make this easier for me. She held his gaze for a long moment. The corridor was cold. Somewhere far above them, she could hear the crows. I'm not making it easier, she said. I'm making it honest. There's a difference. He turned away. His shoulders dropped an inch, and that small collapse was more than she had seen from him in months. I built this empire on the bodies of men who trusted me, he said. I told myself it was necessary, that the lives spent were worth the stability purchased, that the dead would have agreed if they'd seen the alternative. He paused. I have been telling myself that story for 15 years. And now you're wondering if it's still true. Now I'm wondering if I ever had the right to tell it. She stepped forward and put her hand against his back, between his shoulder blades, flat and steady. He went still at the contact. You have 8 days, she said. Use them. I'm not asking you to save me, Draven. I'm asking you to be thorough. He said nothing. She removed her hand and walked back toward her chambers. Behind her, she heard him stay exactly where she'd left him for a long time. Her chambers were in the palace's western tower, chosen 4 years ago because the windows faced the direction of her home province, and she had thought that would matter more than it turned out to. Now she barely looked at the view. What she used the room for was thinking, and for the specific kind of silence that was only possible in a space that belonged entirely to you. She lit the fire herself. She sat on the floor in front of it, not on the chair, not on the formal sitting arrangement, but the floor, the way she'd sat as a child in a house that hadn't had enough chairs, and she pressed her back against the stone base of the hearth and closed her eyes. The dream came even when she was awake now. Fragments, edges, silver light pooling on floor tiles she had never walked across, a voice that was not quite a voice, speaking in a language she did not know, but understood the way you understood that a storm was coming before the sky showed you, through the body, through something older than language. She pressed her wrist where the bruise was and felt the pulse there. You were not made to be still, the voice said. She opened her eyes. The fire was burning at the exact angle it had been. Nothing in the room had moved. She was entirely alone. And yet, there was something she had been not thinking for 3 weeks, ever since she had been standing in the archive looking for records of the last celestial blight cycle, and had found, tucked between 2 unrelated volumes like a letter slipped into the wrong envelope, a text in Old High Veyrati that she could not have read. She had never studied Old High Rathi and had read without difficulty. 3 pages, dense with astronomical notation and theological terminology, and she had stood in the archive for 40 minutes reading it twice, understanding every word, and then had put it back on the shelf and walked out and not spoken about it to anyone. She was not thinking about what that meant, the way you did not think about a door you were not ready to open. She pulled her knees to her chest, listened to the fire, and started to work the problem that mattered right now. The prophecy was the problem, not the blight. The blight was real, the evidence was solid, the dying crops and the blackened rivers did not lie. But Karveth's conclusion was a leap. The ancient texts described a method. They did not guarantee it was the only method, or that the translation was accurate, or that the condition described applied to the specific circumstances of this blight. She had seen enough political manipulation in this court to know that a useful truth and a constructed truth were sometimes indistinguishable from the outside. She needed to read those texts herself. She also needed to understand why Valor Thorn had smiled at her like a man watching a plan complete its final stage. That was the real problem. That was what her bones were telling her, in the language below thought. She was not the sacrifice. She was the objective. The archive opened an hour before dawn to scholars with Imperial clearance. Seraphine had possessed Imperial clearance for 3 years, obtained quietly and never used publicly, through a path of favors and document requests that she had arranged with enough indirection that the specific mechanism was nearly invisible. This was the kind of small, patient engineering that most people in this court attributed to cunning. Seraphine attributed it to growing up poor in a province where the only way to get what you needed was to learn every door in the building before you ever needed to run. She went before the palace woke. The head archivist, a small, careful man named Tolan, looked up from his cataloging when she arrived and blinked twice in that way people did when someone appeared in a place they hadn't expected. Lady Vale. Elder Tolan, I need access to the pre-imperial celestial codex. Primary volumes, not the translations. The primary volumes are in restricted holdings. I know, my clearance covers restricted holdings. He checked. He blinked again. He led her to the back room without further conversation. The pre-imperial celestial codex occupied a shelf by itself, 7 volumes of vellum so old the edges had petrified. She put on the archival gloves Tolan provided, pulled the first volume, and started reading. 3 hours later, she sat back, removed the gloves, and pressed her fingers against her eyes. The text described the blood moon sacrifice. Karveth's translation was accurate, as far as it went. What he had apparently not found, or had not included, was the passage in Volume 4 that described the sacrifice's true nature. Not a death, a threshold crossing. The offering was not destroyed. The offering was revealed. The blood shed beneath the blood moon did not feed the moon. It opened a door. Opened it into the one whose blood was shed. She read that passage 4 times. Then she found the other passage, the one that Karveth had definitely not included, because if he had, the council meeting would have gone very differently. The passage described the conditions under which the blood moon sacrifice was forbidden. It was forbidden, the text said, when the one chosen for the offering carried within them the sleeping soul of a celestial being, because in that case, the threshold crossing would not restore a covenant. It would wake something that had been asleep for 10,000 years. And the world, the text said with the specificity of someone who had seen what they were describing, would not be the same afterward. She sat with that for a long moment. The fire in the archive reading alcove had burned low. The archive was beginning to fill with the sounds of a building waking, distant footsteps, the creak of heavy doors, voices still muffled by distance. She stood. She put the 4th volume back on its shelf with careful hands. She walked to the archive entrance, nodded to Tolan, and stepped out into the corridor, and found 2 of Draven's personal guard waiting for her. Lady Vale. The senior one, a man named Breck, who she knew slightly, had the particular expression of a soldier delivering a message he had not been consulted about. His Majesty requests your presence in the throne room. The full court has been summoned. She looked at him. When? She said. Now, my lady. The second guard, younger, would not quite meet her eyes. She understood what that meant. She had read the archive. She knew what the sacrifice actually was. She knew there was a passage Carveth had missed or hidden. She knew Vaelor had been in this corridor with those priests 3 days ago. None of that mattered in the next 60 seconds, because Draven had made his decision, and the guard sent to escort her was not there to give her information. He was there to make sure she arrived. "Lead the way," she said. The throne room of Vaerath could hold 3,000 people. Today, it was standing room from wall to wall. The court had turned out in full formal regalia. Every lord, every general, every titled advisor, every high-ranking military officer the Empire possessed. The galleries above were packed 3 rows deep. Servants, lower staff, palace workers had found positions along the walls. The air was thick with the smell of many bodies and formal scent, and something underneath both of those that Seraphine, walking the long central aisle toward the dais, recognized as collective-held breath. They all knew why they were here. That was clear from the way they watched her walk. Some of them looked away when she met their eyes. Others held her gaze with that particular expression of people who had already decided what was necessary and were working on believing it. She walked through 300 pairs of eyes and kept her face composed and her back straight and breathed through the constriction in her chest that she had been refusing to call fear for the last 20 minutes. Draven stood at the top of the dais. He was in full formal armor. Ceremonial, not combat, though the distinction was always somewhat academic with Draven, who gave the impression that any clothing he wore was armor because he was armor. And his face was the face she had learned meant the decision was made and the man was now the king. She stopped at the base of the dais steps. They looked at each other across a distance of approximately 12 feet. In the 4 years she had been at this court, she had watched him do things she disagreed with. She had argued with him in private. She had pushed against his certainties with her own. She had never, not once, been uncertain about the nature of what she was to him. Not decorative, not strategic, not a piece on someone else's board. That conviction was currently the only thing making it possible for her to keep breathing normally. "Lady Seraphine Vale," Draven said. His voice carried to every corner of the room without effort, the voice of a man who had been giving commands on open battlefields for 20 years. She said nothing. She waited. The Empire of Vaerath faces a celestial blight that has killed crops, poisoned rivers, and threatens the wolf bloodlines of 20 million souls. The Imperial Council, in consultation with the chief astrologer and the sacred abyss keepers, has determined that only a blood moon sacrifice can restore the covenant. His voice did not waver. It was the voice of a man who had rehearsed this so many times it had become architecture, the words load-bearing walls that he could not allow to crack. The sacrifice must be a mate bound to the ruling bloodline. Silence. "I have made my decision." She watched his face. She watched him hold his jaw at that specific angle that meant he was not going to allow himself to look away, that he was going to look at this thing he was doing with his eyes fully open, because looking away would be the one cowardice he could not forgive himself. She had loved him for that quality. She was not certain right now whether that was still the right word. In 8 days, beneath the blood moon, Lady Seraphine Vale will be offered at the sacred abyss for the salvation of the Vaerath Empire. The room exhaled. Seraphine stood still. She felt the eyes on her, 3,000 pairs calibrating, calculating, recataloguing who she was in light of what she had just become. Not the king's mate, not the quiet woman from the Western Tower who noticed everything and said little. The sacrifice, the necessary cost, the proof of the king's willingness to sacrifice even love on the altar of empire. She looked at Draven. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man watching the only thing in his life he was certain about walk toward the edge of something he had sent it toward. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she tilted her head forward in a very small, very deliberate acknowledgement and turned and walked back down the aisle through the silent court. She did not run. She did not let her face change. She walked all the way to the corridor door, through it, around the corner, and exactly 12 steps down the empty passage before she stopped walking and pressed her back against the wall and put both hands flat against the cold stone and stood there in the silence of a hall no one was in. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of keeping still through everything her body had wanted to do in that room. She stayed against the wall until the shaking stopped. Then she pushed off the stone, straightened her spine, and started thinking like a woman who had 8 days. Because there was something Draven did not know. There was something Veilor did not know. There was, in the back of her memory, growing sharper now, not fading, like a thing pressing through ice from the other side. The echo of a voice that was not the archived text, not her own thoughts, not anything she had a name for. You were not made to be still. She was walking before she knew where she was going. And somewhere very far above the palace, above the empire, above everything, the crows on the spire roof opened their wings and turned to face the direction of the southern border, toward the sacred abyss, as if they were already waiting for what was coming. She found it in Draven's private map room at 2 a.m. She had spent the 8 hours between the throne room announcement and this moment moving through the palace with the careful invisibility she had spent 4 years building, speaking to the right servants, asking indirect questions, establishing what she actually knew versus what she suspected. The distinction mattered. Acting on suspicion without evidence in this court was how people disappeared. What she found in the map room was evidence. She had come looking for the original prophecy documents, the primary record of what the sacred abyss keepers had delivered to the council before Carveth's analysis, the raw material before it went through interpretation. She knew Draven kept originals of everything significant in this room rather than the archive because he trusted control over access more than he trusted archival processes. She found the prophecy folder. She found something else in front of it, filed carelessly, the way things were filed when someone put them back quickly and in stress rather than with intention. It was a communication, originating from the sacred abyss keepers, dated 3 months ago. 3 months before Carveth's official report, 3 months before any public acknowledgement that a celestial blight even existed at a level requiring investigation. Addressed to Chancellor Veilor Thorn. She stood in the dark of the map room with a single candle and read it twice. Then she put it back exactly as she'd found it and stood for a long time looking at nothing. She had been right, not the exact mechanism. She hadn't been right about the exact mechanism, but the shape, the fact of it. Someone had known about the blight before the Empire was told. Someone had known and had not told the king. Someone had worked with the Abyss Keepers, or had positioned themselves to influence the Abyss Keepers before any official consultation occurred, and that someone had filed a private communication directly with the Chancellor of the Empire, and the Chancellor had apparently said nothing about it for 3 months, while the blight spread, while the reports came in. While Draven stood over his war room maps looking at a problem that was consuming his empire and his mind and his choices, and slowly, systematically, left him with only one option, the option that required her death. She blew out the candle. She stood in the dark. The voice from the archive was back, not in words exactly, but in sensation, the way heat came off a fire before you were close enough to feel it clearly. Something building, something far away, and getting closer, the way a thunderstorm announced itself through atmospheric pressure before a single cloud was visible. She put her hand flat against the map room wall. Underneath her palm, through the stone, through the floor, through every layer of constructed material between her and the dark earth below. She felt something pulse. Once, like a heartbeat. Like the Empire itself, or something older than the Empire, had felt her here in this dark room with her revelation and had responded. She took her hand off the wall and walked to the door. 8 days. She had 8 days to tear apart a 3-month conspiracy, convince a king who had just publicly committed his empire to her death that he was wrong, and figure out what was happening to her body in the dark hours when the dreams came and left marks on her skin. The silver light she had seen in her dreams was not in her dreams anymore. She had seen it, for just a moment, reflected in the glass of the darkened map room window, coming from no source outside the room, coming from her own eyes. She stopped in the doorway. She did not turn back to check. She walked into the corridor, and behind her, on the wall where she had placed her hand, a single small moon sigil burned in the stone for 3 long seconds, white silver, deliberate, ancient, before fading back to dark. The wall showed nothing. The corridor showed nothing. The night held its silence the way nights do when something has just shifted, irrevocably, beneath the surface of everything. Uh, in the palace above her, Draven Voss sat in the war room alone for the second night in a row, unable to sleep, unable to eat, staring at a map of an empire he had built on the promise that he would never let it fall. He had made the decision he believed was necessary. He had made it looking at the woman it would destroy. He was a king. He understood sacrifice. He was also a man who had not, until the moment she tilted her head in that throne room with the calm of someone who had accepted something he had not yet accepted himself, understood the precise cost of everything he had never said. He sat with that cost in the silence of the war room. Outside, the crows were gone from the spire. No one had seen them leave, and on the southern horizon, for the first time in living memory, the sky above the sacred abyss was beginning to glow. The glow on the southern horizon was still there when dawn came. Not brighter, not dimmer, just present, the way a held breath was present, sustained by something that had not yet decided to release. The palace servants who noticed it said nothing. The sentries on the southern wall noticed it and said nothing either, which was its own kind of statement. In Veyrath, you survived by being selective about what you saw. Seraphine had not slept. She sat at her writing table as the early light came through the western windows and turned the stone floor from gray to pale gold, and she worked through what she knew the same way she had worked through every problem in her life. By writing it down in a hand so small it looked like decoration rather than text, and then reading it back until the shape of it became clear. What she knew, the Chancellor had received private communication from the Sacred Abyss Keepers 3 months before the official crisis was acknowledged. What she knew, Carveth's analysis of the prophecy had omitted a passage describing conditions under which the sacrifice was forbidden. What she knew, Valor Thorn had smiled at her like a man watching a clock reach zero. What she did not know, whether Carveth had missed the passage or buried it, whether the Abyss Keepers had been corrupted or coerced, whether Valor's endgame was the throne itself or something else entirely. What she suspected, and could not yet prove, that the blight was not a natural deterioration of the celestial covenant, that it had a source, that the source was human and deliberate and patient. She folded the paper and burned it in the candle flame without standing up. Then she went to find Aldrich. General Aldrich kept his private office on the military floor, a functional room with no decoration except for 2 campaign maps that had been on the walls so long the edges had yellowed. He was there when she arrived, which she had calculated he would be. Aldrich ran on military time and had probably been at his desk for 2 hours already. He looked up when she entered and did not look surprised, which meant he had been expecting someone, or expecting her specifically, or both. Lady Vale. General. She closed the door behind her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly rather than carefully. He leaned back in his chair. He was a large man, gray at the temples, with the specific stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost lives. Those aren't always different things. In this case, they are. He studied her for a moment. Whatever he saw made him nod once, slowly, the way old soldiers nodded when they recognized a situation they'd been in before. Ask. Has the king received independent analysis of Carveth's findings? Someone outside the council structure? He requested it 2 days ago. The response came back this morning. Aldrich paused. It confirmed Carveth's conclusions. Did the responding scholar have access to primary texts or to Carveth's translated excerpts? The pause this time was different, longer. I don't know. Find out. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but somewhere in the territory between them. You understand what you're doing. I'm asking questions. You're building a case for the king to overturn a decision he's already made publicly before the full court. If you succeed, you humiliate him in front of an empire. If you fail... He stopped. If I fail, she said, I die in 8 days. 7 now. She held his gaze. Find out whether the secondary scholar had primary text access, please. He stood up. I'll have an answer by midday. She left without thanking him. Gratitude, in this palace, created debts that complicated everything. Valor found her at noon. She had been expecting this. A man who had spent 3 months engineering a precise outcome did not sit still while the intended piece began moving on its own. He came to her in the East Garden, where she had positioned herself in full visibility, in open air with 3 different sight lines to palace entrances, because this conversation was going to happen and she preferred it in a location where there were no enclosed walls and no plausible reasons for accidents. He walked toward her with that measured pace that had always reminded her of something large and patient covering ground without appearing to hurry. "Lady Vale." He stopped a comfortable social distance away. "I wanted to offer my personal condolences. The king's decision was difficult for all of us who care about this court." "That's very kind. I know this must be overwhelming." "Do you?" Something shifted in his eyes, so small that anyone not watching specifically for it would have missed it entirely. "If there's anything I can do to support you in the coming days, there is actually." She turned to face him directly. In her experience, people like Violor were accustomed to indirect approaches, to the dance of implication, and the most disorienting thing you could do was simply look at them straight and speak plainly. "I've been reviewing the celestial records, the historical ones, not Carveth's analysis. I came across something interesting." He waited. His face was still. His face was very good at being still. "There are conditions described in the pre-imperial texts under which the blood moon sacrifice is specifically contraindicated. Did Carveth include those in his report to the council?" "I'm not a scholar, Lady Vale." "The specifics of the astrologer's methodology are outside my—" "You received correspondence from the sacred abyss keepers 3 months ago," she said, "before the council was convened, before the blight was publicly acknowledged. I'm wondering what that correspondence described." The garden was quiet. A bird called somewhere in the far hedgerow. She heard it very clearly. She heard her own pulse, steady and deliberate, the way it went when she had committed to something and the time for reconsidering was behind her. Valor looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was still warm. That warmth, she now understood, was not performance. It was simply how he operated. Everything, including the most dangerous things, delivered in the register of reasonable concern. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "Draven has always underestimated what he had in you." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He tilted his head slightly. "Be careful, Lady Vale. A woman in your position, spending her last 7 days pursuing questions rather than making peace, it would concern the people who care about her stability. Her clarity of mind." He paused. "There are those who might wonder if the weight of the king's decision had affected her judgment." She held his gaze. "There are those who might wonder that," she said. "And there are those who might wonder why a chancellor of the empire would receive advance notice of a celestial crisis and decline to bring it immediately to his king." He smiled, warm, gentle, completely cold at its center. "Enjoy the garden," he said. "The roses are at their best this time of year." He walked away at the same measured pace he had arrived with. She stood in the garden and did not watch him go because she did not need to. She already knew everything she needed to know from what had just happened, because a man with nothing to hide did not deliver warnings dressed as concern. A man with nothing to hide did not immediately move to questions of her mental stability. He had told her, with absolute precision, exactly what he would do if she kept pushing. She intended to keep pushing. She just needed to do it faster. Quote. Aldrich's answer came 2 hours later, delivered by a junior aide who handed her a folded note and left without meeting her eyes. 4 words. Excerpts only, not primary. She read it twice, then folded it into her sleeve. The secondary scholar who had confirmed Carveth's findings had worked from Carveth's excerpts, not from the original texts, which meant the confirmation was circular. It proved only that 2 scholars reading the same selected passages reached the same conclusion. It proved nothing about what the unselected passages said. She needed to get that information to Draven. The problem was access. Since the throne room announcement, the king's schedule had been restructured. More guards, more formal requests required for audience. The architecture of a man who had made a decision he could not allow to be undermined by proximity to the person that decision affected. She understood the logic. She also understood that it was Vaelor's logic, wearing Draven's face. She had one option. She used it at dusk, when the duty roster shifted and the corridor outside Draven's private study had exactly a 4-minute window of reduced observation. She had mapped this window 3 weeks ago for reasons she had not articulated to herself at the time. She let herself in through the secondary entrance and stood in the center of his study and waited. He came in 20 minutes later, absorbed in a document, and stopped dead when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked older than he had yesterday, not in any specific visible way. Same face, same posture, same controlled stillness. But something in the air around him was depleted, the way a fire looked after it had been burning for hours. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. "I know. I gave orders." "I know, Draven." He closed the door. He looked at the document in his hand like he'd forgotten what it was, then set it on his desk without reading it. "What do you want?" The secondary scholar who confirmed Carveth's analysis. He worked from excerpts, not primary text. Draven was still for a moment. That doesn't necessarily mean there are passages in the primary text that Carveth didn't include. I read them. They describe conditions under which the sacrifice is specifically forbidden. She watched his face. "Draven, the confirmation of the prophecy is circular. One scholar's selection of sources verified by another scholar reading the same selection. You went to the archive." "Yes." "You went to the archive the morning after the throne room announcement." His voice was flat in that way that meant he was processing something he hadn't prepared for. "You read primary texts in Old High Veirathi." "Yes." "You don't read Old High Veirathi." She met his eyes and said nothing. The silence in the study had a texture. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized but could not quite name, something between the way you looked at a thing you thought you understood and the moment you realized you had been looking at only one face of it. "What did the passages say?" he said quietly. "That the sacrifice is forbidden when the one chosen carries within them the soul of a celestial being, because the ritual doesn't kill, it opens a door. And if what's inside is already celestial?" She stopped. His jaw was tight. "Then what?" "I don't know what the text was describing exactly, but it was written by someone who had seen it happen, and they were clearly afraid of the result." He turned away. He put both hands flat on his desk and stood with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the back of his neck and the way his breathing had changed. Not faster, but deeper, the breathing of a man pressing down something that was trying to come up. "Even if that's true," he said, "even if the passages say what you're describing, I can't unmake this publicly. The court witnessed the announcement. The entire empire will know within days. If I reverse course, if I say the analysis was incomplete, the empire will know you prioritized accuracy over appearance. The empire will see a king who makes decisions and then unmakes them when his mate argues otherwise." He turned. His eyes were hard with something that had the shape of anger but wasn't. "They'll see weakness. And in Veirath, weakness is an invitation." "Then let them see it," she said. Her own voice surprised her. Not sharp, not heated, but absolute in the way that a thing was absolute when it had been sitting underneath everything you'd said for years, waiting for the right moment. "Let them see a king who got wrong information and corrected course. That's not weakness, Draven. That's the only thing that separates rule from stubbornness." He stared at her. "There's something else," she said, because there was no benefit to parceling this out. "Valor received correspondence from the Abyss Keepers 3 months before the council was convened, before the crisis was acknowledged publicly. I found the record in your map room." The air in the study changed. Draven's face didn't move. The very specific stillness of a man whose mind was running very fast beneath a controlled surface. "Are you certain?" "I held the document." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and very careful. "If that's accurate, then someone knew the blight was coming. Someone who was positioned to influence how the Empire was informed. Someone who waited 3 months and then, once the crisis reached the point where only one option looked viable, brought it to your council with the conclusion already built in." She held his gaze. "Someone who has been 2 steps ahead of this entire crisis because he was involved in creating it." The study was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the distant change of the evening guard, the rhythm of the palace continuing its mechanical order, while something inside this room cracked along a line that couldn't be uncracked. "I need to verify the document," Draven said. "I know. I need to do this carefully. If I move on Vylor without evidence that holds, I know." He looked at her. The king had gone somewhere underneath him for a moment, and it was the man looking at her. The specific, exhausted man who had sat in a war room for 2 nights unable to sleep, who had walked her to an altar she didn't deserve, and felt the cost of it in every step. 6 days, he said. 6 days, she agreed. She left through the same secondary entrance. She moved through the corridor at a pace that looked purposeful without looking hurried, the skill of someone who had spent 4 years being invisible when she needed to be. She made it to the east stairwell before Valor's man stepped out of the alcove. Not Valor himself. One of his people. She recognized him. A mid-level secretary named Corvin, who had always been positioned 1 room away from every significant conversation in this palace. He was not large. He did not make any threatening gesture. He simply stood in the stairwell with an expression of mild regret that was far more frightening than aggression would have been. "Lady Vale," he said, "the Chancellor thought you might be tired after a long day. He's arranged for your personal guard rotation to be adjusted. For your comfort and safety." He paused. "Your chambers have been secured. Someone will escort you there now." She looked at him. She looked at the 2 men behind him, neither of whom were palace guard. The insignia was wrong. The stance was wrong. These were Valor's people wearing borrowed uniforms, and they were between her and every corridor that led anywhere useful. She understood what this was. Not a threat. Not yet. A demonstration. A door closing before she reached it. A message delivered in the language of rearranged architecture. You moved faster than expected, and now the board has adjusted. She had 6 days. She had evidence in a map room that would be empty when Draven went to verify it. She had a king who believed her but needed proof. And she had just been escorted with perfect politeness into a gilded trap. Corvin gestured toward the corridor. "This way, Lady Vale." She walked. She walked because the alternative was a confrontation she could not win physically and could not survive politically. Not yet, not with nothing in her hands. She walked and she thought about the sigil that had burned on the wall and the way the map room window had reflected light from a source that did not exist. She walked and felt, very clearly, the sensation of something inside her, old, enormous, not quite awake, pressing against the inside of her skin like a tide against a wall. Not frightening, patient, like something that had been waiting a very long time and had just been given a reason to stop waiting. The door to her chambers closed behind her. The lock turned. Outside, Corvin's footsteps moved away down the corridor. Seraphine stood in the center of her chambers in the growing dark, and pressed her palm flat against her sternum, and felt her own heartbeat against her hand. It was no longer entirely her own. It was 2 rhythms, hers and something beneath hers, something that did not have a name she knew yet, something that was waking up. The second heartbeat was still there in the morning. Seraphine lay on her back in the dark before dawn and listened to it the way you listen to a sound you could not identify. Not with fear exactly, but with the suspended alertness of someone who understood that the next few seconds would determine whether fear was the appropriate response. It was not painful. It was not intrusive. It simply existed beneath her own pulse like a foundation existed beneath a building, present before anything else, older than everything built on top of it. She sat up. Her chambers were locked from the outside. She had spent 2 hours the previous night determining the precise scope of the situation, which windows were now watched, whether the servants assigned to her had been replaced, whether her personal effects had been searched. The answers were, all of them, yes and yes. Valor had been thorough. He was always thorough. That was the thing about a man who had been patient for 3 months. When he finally moved, he moved with the completeness of someone who had rehearsed every contingency. She was not panicking. Panic was what happened when you had been surprised. She had not been surprised. She had known, from the moment she saw that document in the map room, that this was coming. She had moved faster than Valor expected, and he had adjusted, and now she was locked in a room with 6 days left and no clear path to Draven. She washed her face in the cold basin water and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were the same dark gray they had always been. She looked at them for a long moment, the way you looked at a familiar thing when you were trying to determine whether it had changed, and decided that whatever was different about her was not visible yet. She started on the problem. Heck, the chambermaid who brought her breakfast was new, young, nervous, and carrying herself with the specific over-careful attention of someone who had been told exactly what to say and what not to say. Seraphine let her set the tray down and thanked her, and waited until the girl was almost at the door. "What's your name?" she asked. The girl stopped, turned. "Mira, my lady." "Mira." Seraphine looked at her steadily. "How long have you worked in the palace?" 3 months, my lady." 3 months. Valor's people then planted during exactly the window when the correspondence from the Abyss Keepers arrived. She noted it and let the girl leave without further questions because frightening her would accomplish nothing. She ate the breakfast because she needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required fuel, and then she sat at her writing table and looked at the locked door and considered the geometry of her situation with the same methodical attention she had given every constraint in her life. She needed to reach Draven. Valor controlled her physical access to the palace. The document in the map room would be gone by now, right? She had no evidence she could physically produce. Aldrich was her only ally with proximity to the king, but Aldrich moved through official channels, and official channels were now Valor's territory. She needed something Valor didn't know she had. She spent an hour going through her memory of the archived texts, not the passage about the forbidden conditions, which she had already shared with Draven, but the larger body of what she had read in those 3 hours. The pre-imperial celestial codex had contained more than the sacrifice protocols. It had contained historical accounts, astronomical records, event narratives from the period before the Empire's founding. One narrative had mentioned the Abyss Keepers specifically. She had not paid close attention to it at the time because it had not seemed relevant. She pulled it from her memory now and looked at it carefully. The passage had described the Keepers' original function, not as guardians of a sacred site, but as recorders of celestial events, specifically as the only people authorized to maintain the unbroken observational record of the moon's covenant with the wolf bloodlines. The record went back 10,000 years. The record was kept in the Abyss Chambers, in physical form, because the founders of the Keeper Order had believed that a record that could be copied could be altered, and a record that existed only in one physical location could only be altered by someone willing to go there in person. Valor had been in contact with the Keepers for 3 months. He had not, as far as she knew, traveled to the Sacred Abyss himself. Someone had gone for him, which meant the original record, the unaltered 10,000-year observational record, was still there. And if the blight was manufactured rather than natural, that record would show it. It would show the covenant breaking from the outside rather than deteriorating from within. It would show interference. It was the only evidence that couldn't be removed from a map room because it had never been in this palace. She needed to get to the Sacred Abyss. She was currently locked in a tower. She put her head in her hands for exactly 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she permitted herself for the specific frustration of having the answer and not the means. And then she lifted her head and started working the next problem. Aldrich came at midday. Not officially. There was no official reason for a general to visit a woman whose chambers were under enhanced security protocols. He came as part of a routine inspection of the Western Tower Guard rotation, which was his legitimate authority, and he spent 3 minutes in the corridor outside her door talking to the guard about duty schedules in a voice loud enough for her to hear through the door. She understood immediately. She moved to the door and spoke against the gap at floor level, her voice below the threshold of carrying. "The map room document will be gone. Don't look for it." A pause. She could hear his breathing change slightly, the adjustment of someone receiving information and integrating it rapidly. "I need the king to go to the Sacred Abyss Keepers directly, not through council channels, not through Carveth, the original observational record. If the blight is manufactured, the record will show asymmetric disruption, external interference rather than internal deterioration." Another pause. "Tell him I said the answer is in the oldest record, not the newest interpretation. He'll understand." She heard Aldrich's footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, continue down the corridor. She sat back on her heels and pressed her palm flat against the stone floor. The second heartbeat pulsed once, steady, bumk. 3 hours later, Draven came himself. She heard his stride before the door opened. There was a way he moved through spaces that other people also moved through, a cadence that compressed the surrounding sounds without being loud. And she had learned it the way you learned a weather pattern you'd been inside enough times to recognize by feel. The door opened. He stood in the frame and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment that had several things in it simultaneously. The residue of the throne room announcement, the previous night's conversation, and something older than both of those that had never fully been named between them. Then he came inside and closed the door. "I went to the map room," he said. "I know." "The folder was there. There was no correspondence in it." "I know." "Seraphine." "I know what I held," she said. "I know what I read. The document existed. It doesn't anymore because someone removed it in the hours between when I saw it and when you went to verify it. That's not evidence that I was wrong. That's evidence that someone knew I'd found it." He stood in the center of the room and looked at her with that expression that was not doubt exactly, but was the thing that lived next to doubt in a man trained to require verification for everything. "Aldrich relayed your message," he said, "about the observational record. Will you go?" Going to the sacred abyss personally, 6 days before a publicly announced sacrifice ritual, without council authorization, it would destabilize the... "Will you go?" she said again. He looked at her for a long time, the particular look of a man who was deciding whether to trust something he could not prove over something he could see and measure. "Yes," he said, quietly. "Tomorrow." Something in her chest that had been very tight for 36 hours released approximately 1 degree. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed, not colder, denser, the way stone was denser than the air around it. "Valor has requested an emergency council session for this evening. He has evidence, he says, of a threat to Imperial security." Draven's jaw was set. "He has a witness who claims to have seen you in the map room 2 nights ago, removing documents." The room was very quiet. "He's moved first," she said. "He's moved first," Draven confirmed. She absorbed this. It was faster than she had expected. Valor accelerating his timeline, which meant Valor had decided that the cautious approach was no longer sufficient, which meant he knew she was closer to something than he was comfortable with. "What does the witness claim I removed?" "Imperial security communications. The claim is that you've been in contact with a foreign faction seeking to exploit the Blight crisis." He said it flatly, without editorial. "The charge, if the council accepts it, allows for immediate detention separate from the current arrangements. More restrictive, less accessible." Less accessible to Draven. That was the point. She understood the architecture immediately, not just locking her in a room, but building a legal structure around her that made it politically dangerous for even Draven to move against. "If you defend me publicly tonight, it looks like a king protecting his mate over Imperial security," she said. "Yes. If you don't defend me, the council moves forward with the charge, and by the time you reach the abyss and return with whatever evidence exists, I'll be in a detention that makes the current situation look open." "Yes." She stood up. The specific movement of someone who has been sitting still long enough that the sitting itself has become a decision, and the decision has changed. "There's something you need to know," she said. "About me. About what the archive passages were actually describing." He waited. She said it plainly, without decoration, because she had decided in the last 36 hours that the time for strategic omission was over. She told him what the passage said about the celestial being sleeping inside the chosen sacrifice. She told him about the 2 heartbeats. She told him about the light in the window that had no source. He was very still for the duration of this. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the distant sounds of the palace, footsteps, voices, the mechanical continuity of an empire that did not know any of this was happening. "How long," he said quietly, "have you known something was different?" "The dreams started 2 years ago, the second heartbeat, 2 days. The light, 2 nights ago. And you didn't tell me." I didn't have language for it. I still barely have language for it. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you now. Another silence. Then, does it frighten you? She considered this honestly. No, she said. That's what frightens me. He looked at her with that expression she couldn't name again. It was not the king's expression. It was something underneath the king, something that had been running alongside everything else for years and had never been given a surface to exist on. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her with the specific, desperate certainty of a man who had spent 6 days trying to be a king first and had just run out of the ability to maintain the distinction. She held on to his forearms and let herself be present in it for exactly as long as it lasted. When he pulled back, his eyes were open and closed and looked at her like she was something he was trying to memorize. I'm going to the abyss tomorrow, he said. I know. Tonight, I'm going to the council session. Draven, I'm going to listen to Vaelor's witness and his evidence, and I'm going to respond with nothing that commits me in either direction, and I'm going to use what I see in that room to understand exactly who else is involved. His voice was controlled and cold and absolute in the way that meant the king was back, but the man was still behind the king's eyes, watching. Stay in this room. Do not do anything that gives them grounds to accelerate the charge. And if the council votes tonight, then I use the king's prerogative to delay formal proceedings pending independent verification. He stepped back. It buys 12 hours. Will that be enough? He looked at her once more from the doorway. It has to be, he said. He left. She stood in the empty room and pressed her fingers against her mouth and then dropped her hand and turned to face the window. The glow on the southern horizon was brighter tonight. She was looking at it, thinking through the next 12 hours with the part of her mind that never stopped calculating, when the door opened again. She turned expecting a servant. It was Carveth. The old astrologer stood in the doorway alone, without guards, without ceremony, with the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally arrived at the place where he could put it down. Lady Vale, he said. His voice was different than it had been in the council chambers, older, stripped of the professional steadiness. I need to speak with you. I have perhaps 10 minutes before I am missed. She looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were trembling slightly. She looked at his eyes, which had the specific quality of a person who had not slept in days and had been awake for reasons that had nothing to do with scholarship. Sit down, she said. He sat. He pressed his hands together in his lap. Then he looked up at her. My analysis was not complete, he said. I was aware of the passages you found. I was told to omit them. The room was absolutely quiet. By whom? She said. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent his professional life believing in the purity of knowledge and had recently discovered what happened to that belief when power decided knowledge was inconvenient. By Vaelor, he said. 6 weeks ago. He came to me with documentation, correspondence I had written, taken out of context, assembled into something that looked like I had been taking payments from the Northern Separatist faction. He told me that if the analysis did not reach the conclusion the Empire required, the documentation would be submitted to the Imperial Security Council. He stopped. His hands pressed harder together. I have a daughter. She works in the northern provinces. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing about betrayal that no story ever quite captured. It was almost never simple. It was almost never a villain who wanted evil for its own sake. It was almost always a person who had been handed a set of options, all of them bad, and had chosen the one that protected something specific, and had told themselves it was necessary, and had then lived inside that necessity long enough that they had forgotten they were the one who chose it. Carveth was shaking. The passages describe what would happen if the sacrifice carried a celestial soul, she said. Not a question. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. It wouldn't kill you. It would awaken something that has been dormant for 10 millennia, something Vaelor has been trying to prevent from awakening because... He stopped. Because why? He looked at her with something that was past fear, past calculation. Just old eyes and an old face seeing something clearly for the first time in weeks. Because the last time it awakened, he said, it ended in empire, not Veyrath, the one before it, the one whose ruins the first Voss king built this throne on top of. He paused. The celestial power that woke destroyed everything in its path until it found what it was looking for. What was it looking for? She said. The one who had tried to kill it, Carveth said. The one who had put it in a mortal body to begin with, to keep it contained. The one who bound it in flesh and called it sacrifice and told the world it was necessary. He held her gaze. Baelor is not trying to save the Empire, Lady Vale. He is trying to prevent you from waking up. Because if you wake up... The door crashed open. Two of Vaelor's men, not in borrowed uniforms this time, in the Chancellor's own livery, official and visible, which meant this was not covert anymore. This was Vaelor deciding that the timeline had collapsed and speed was now more important than subtlety. They crossed the room and took Carveth by the arms. He did not struggle. He looked at Seraphine with the expression of a man who had finally done one right thing and was prepared to pay whatever it cost. Lady Vale, one of Vaelor's men said, the Chancellor requests that you accompany us to a secure location pending the Council's vote this evening. She stood still. She looked at the men holding Carveth. She looked at the door. She looked at the window, where the southern glow painted the bottom of the clouds in a color that had no name in any language she knew. And she felt it, the second heartbeat, no longer simply present but active, pressing against the inside of her chest with a rhythm that was accelerating, a door shaking in a frame, something on the other side that had been patient for 10,000 years and had just been given a very specific reason to stop being patient. Vaelor's man stepped toward her. She looked at him, and from somewhere in the deep architecture of what she was becoming, she made a decision she could not unmake. She stopped running the calculation. She stopped measuring options. She let go of the wall she had built between herself and whatever lived in the space beneath her pulse. Just enough. Just a fraction. The temperature in the room dropped 6 degrees in 2 seconds. Every candle flame bent simultaneously toward her, as if a wind had moved through the room from the outside in, and then stood straight up burning silver instead of gold. Vaelor's man stopped walking. He looked at the candles. He looked at her. His face showed for the first time something that was not confidence. Lady Vale, he said again, but the warmth was gone from the professional address. Just the words, floating in a room that had become very cold and very bright. She looked at him with eyes that were beginning, at their very center, to glow. Tell the Chancellor, she said quietly, that the timeline has changed. The two men didn't move for 3 full seconds. That was enough. Seraphine did not wait for them to recover from whatever they were seeing in her eyes. She crossed the room in 4 strides, put her shoulder into the man holding Carveth's left arm, with the compact force of someone who had grown up doing physical labor before she ever learned to be elegant, and he went sideways into the wall. The second man grabbed for her arm, and she let him take it, let him feel the temperature of her skin, which was wrong, which was the cold of a deep place that had no fire in it, and watched his grip loosen automatically, the body overriding the order before the mind could reassert it. Go, she said to Carveth. The old man moved faster than she expected. Years of archive work, apparently, had kept something functional in him. He was through the door and into the corridor before the first man had fully recovered his footing. She followed. The corridor outside her chambers was not empty. 2 more of Vaelor's people at the far end, already turning at the sound of impact from inside the room. She went the other direction without hesitation, toward the servant's stair she had mapped 3 years ago as an alternative exit she would probably never need and had needed twice since, and was about to need again. Keep moving, she said to Carveth, who was breathing hard but keeping pace. Where's Draven right now? Council chamber, he gasped. The session started an hour ago. She ran the math. Council chamber was in the eastern wing. She was in the western tower. Between those 2 points, every corridor in this palace that Vaelor's people knew to watch, which was all of them, because Vaelor had been studying this building for 3 administrations. She took the servant's stair down 2 levels, then went sideways through the laundry access that connected the western tower to the old garrison wing, A passage so low-ceilinged and obscure that she had found it herself only because she had spent a rainy afternoon in her second year walking every wall of the palace she could access and pressing on stones that looked different from the ones around them. Carveth followed her through it, bent nearly double, one hand on the wall. "Valor's plan," she said, not slowing. "Tell me the rest. What does he want?" "The throne." His breath came in short bursts. "But not directly. He can't take it directly. The military would never accept it. He needs a succession crisis. If the king performs the sacrifice and the sacrifice awakens what it's going to awaken, the resulting chaos, the celestial event, the empire destabilized, gives him the opening to position himself as the one who restores order. He's been manufacturing the chaos he plans to solve. For 3 years. The blight itself. I don't know exactly how he did it, but the Abyss records will show it. He disrupted the Covenant from the outside using something in the Keeper archives. Old knowledge. Dangerous knowledge that the Keepers were supposed to have destroyed generations ago and apparently didn't. She processed this while moving. The garrison passage led out into a storage area off the main eastern corridor, 20 feet from the council chamber's secondary entrance. She stopped at the edge and looked. 2 guards at the secondary entrance. Palace guard. Actual palace guard. Draven's people, not Valor's borrowed uniforms. She breathed marginally easier. "Stay here," she told Carveth. She walked out of the storage area at a measured pace, not running, because running made you a problem, and walking with purpose made you someone on an errand, and she had spent 4 years learning that the distinction was everything in this palace. The guard saw her and straightened. Lady Vale. The senior one, a woman named Tessari, who had been on palace duty for 6 years and had a permanent crease between her eyebrows from doing exactly that, looked at her with the specific expression of someone encountering a situation not covered by her current orders. "The council chamber is in closed session. I need to speak with the king, directly, now. My orders are..." "Tessari." She looked at the guard steadily. "In approximately 4 minutes, Valor's personal security is going to reach this corridor. When they do, they're going to tell you that they have Chancellor's authority to take me into detention. You're going to have to decide in that moment whether you serve the Chancellor or the king. I'm asking you to make that decision right now, while you still have the option of making it on your own terms." Tessari stared at her. The crease between her eyebrows deepened. Then she stepped aside. The council chamber went silent when she walked in. 12 men around the circular table. Draven at his position. Not the head, there was no head, but the point that everything else oriented around. Valor on the opposite side, and she saw the exact moment he registered her presence because his face did not change at all, which was the only change a face like his ever showed. Draven was on his feet before she had crossed half the room. "Seraphine, Carveth is in the East Garrison Passage," she said. "He needs protection. Valor's people are currently 30 seconds behind me." She looked at Draven directly. "He'll tell you everything. He was coerced into altering the analysis." The chamber erupted. Multiple voices, multiple men standing, the specific chaos of a room full of powerful people encountering a situation that had moved faster than their ability to manage it. Draven cut through it with one word, one volume level, the voice that had given commands on open battlefields. "Quiet. Quiet." He looked at Valor across the table. And this was the thing about Draven Voss that she had understood from the second year. The thing that had made her stay when leaving would have been safer. He was not a man who needed certainty before he moved. He was a man who could look at another person and read the shape of what was true in them, the way a good general read terrain, not from a map, but from the ground beneath his feet. He was reading Valor right now. And Valor, for the first time in her experience of him, looked like a man who had run out of warm. "Aldrich," Draven said without looking away from Valor. The general was already moving toward the door. "The Chancellor is not to leave the chamber," Draven said. "Any member of his personal security found in the palace is to be detained for questioning." He paused. "Now." Aldrich went. Valor stood still. He looked at Seraphine with the expression of a man recalculating. Not panicking, never panicking, that was not in his nature, but genuinely reevaluating the board. She had reached the king. Carveth was accessible. The timeline had collapsed in the wrong direction. My king, Valor said. His voice was still measured, still reasonable, still wearing the coat of a man who grieved. Lady Vale has been under significant duress. I understand the impulse to... Chancellor. Draven's voice was very quiet, the quietest she had ever heard it, which was its own kind of warning. Stop talking. Valor stopped. The chamber held its breath. Then, from outside, distant, muffled by stone and corridor but unmistakable, the sound of men running in something else. A sound she had not heard before and had no reference for. A low resonance, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears, like a very large bell struck once and held. Coming from the south. Everyone in the chamber felt it. She saw it move through the room. Heads turning, the involuntary response of bodies registering something their conscious minds hadn't processed yet. The blood moon was in 6 days. That sound was not a 6-day-away sound. That sound was immediate. The palace shook. Not an earthquake. She knew the difference, had felt the northern tremors that rolled through Veyrath twice in her time here. This was vertical. A compression from above, as if the sky had pressed down once with a flat hand. Dust came from the ceiling of the council chamber in a fine drift. Then the screaming started. Outside in the courtyard, the distant scream of sentries cut short. Draven was already moving toward the door. She was a step behind him and matching his pace without thinking, the automatic synchronization of two people who had been in proximity long enough that threat response had become a shared reflex. The courtyard outside the eastern wing was full of smoke, not fire smoke. Something else, darker, without flame, moving against the wind rather than with it. In the center of the courtyard, 3 of Valor's men were on the ground and not moving, and in the space above the courtyard wall, against the night sky, something was visible that had no clean name in the language of natural things. Shadow beasts. She had read about them once, in a text so old the ink had faded to suggestions rather than words. Pre-imperial weapons, constructed from severed celestial matter and bound to a human controller. Illegal for the entirety of Veyrath's existence because the Empire's founders had understood that things built from severed celestial matter were inherently unstable. You could direct them but never fully control them, and when the control broke, they fed on whatever was nearest. They were the size of horses and moved like water finding cracks in stone. Draven stopped in the courtyard entrance and assessed the situation with the rapid stillness of a man who had trained his whole life for exactly this specific category of impossible. He released them, she said. He was always going to. Draven's voice was flat, operational. The plan failed. He's burning what he can't take with him. Behind them, she heard Aldrich's voice. Commands, rapid and specific, the sound of military organization snapping into place. The palace guard was mobilizing. She could hear it building across the compound like a pressure wave. Draven turned to her. In the smoke and the dark, and the sound of the shadow beasts moving through the outer courtyard, he looked at her with that underneath the king expression. The man. The abyss, he said. I know. If Valor used something from the Keeper archives to create the Blight, the mechanism is still active. Even if we take him tonight, the Blight continues. The Covenant stays broken. The Empire dies slower, but it still dies. His jaw was set. I have to get to the abyss. Not tonight, not through that. She gestured at the courtyard. Not through the courtyard, through the garrison gate. He looked at her steadily. Come with me. She looked at him. 6 days ago, he had announced her death to 3,000 people. 3 days ago, she had found evidence of a conspiracy in his own map room. 2 hours ago, he had kissed her in a locked room, like a man saying something he didn't have words for. Right now, he was standing in smoke and chaos, asking her to ride with him toward the one place that might end all of this, and the 2 heartbeats in her chest were running in the same rhythm for the first time since she'd become aware of the second one. And that synchronization felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known to ask. Yes, she said. Boss. They rode hard through the night with 8 of Draven's personal guard and Aldrich, who had handed palace command to his second and come himself without being asked because Aldrich was the kind of man who understood which moments required a general and which required a person who could be trusted without further discussion. The road to the sacred abyss was 2 days at normal pace. They made it in one, changing horses at the Imperial relay stations, stopping only as long as it took to switch mounts and drink water, pushing through the dark with torches that the wind tried to kill every half hour and couldn't. Seraphine rode. She had grown up on horseback, in a province where distances were long and nothing else was faster, and she rode now the way she'd ridden at 15, low, practical, part of the animal's movement rather than sitting on top of it. The second heartbeat had settled into a running rhythm that matched the horse's gait, which was a strange comfort, the kind of comfort that came from things lining up in ways you didn't expect. She thought about what Carveth had said. The last time it awakened, it ended an empire. The one before Veyrath, the one whose ruins the first Voss king had built his throne on top of. She had been turning this over for hours and had arrived at a question she could not answer alone. Was that ending a destruction or a conclusion? Was the empire that ended one that deserved ending, built on something corrupt, built on the suppression of the celestial power itself, built by the same type of person who had constructed Valor's patient 3-month conspiracy? She did not know. She knew only that she was not what she had been a week ago, and that the change was not reversible, and that reversible had stopped being a relevant category sometime around the moment the candles burned silver. Draven rode beside her in silence for most of the night. Near dawn, he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask?" "When this is over, when we have what we need from the abyss and we go back and we end this, what are you?" She looked at the road ahead. The sky was beginning to lighten at its very eastern edge, the purple gray of early morning, and ahead of them on the horizon she could see the abyss glow, much stronger now, pulsing with the slow rhythm of something that had been asleep and was not anymore. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think that depends on what happens at the abyss. And what happens to us after." She turned and looked at him. On horseback in the pre-dawn dark, exhausted and smoke-stained, and asking her a question that had nothing to do with empire or strategy, he looked like a man who had arrived at the end of a very long piece of pretending. "I don't know that either," she said, "but I'm still here asking the same question you are. That counts for something." He looked at her for a moment, then faced forward. "It does," he said. The Sacred Abyss was a structure that predated the Empire by 4,000 years. It had been built into the base of a cliff face along the southern border, a descending complex of chambers that went deep into the earth, and the Keeper Order had maintained it across every regime change and political upheaval Veyrath had ever experienced, because every version of power that had ever held this land had understood that the Abyss was not a tool. It was a record, and destroying a record did not change what had been recorded. The outer gate stood open when they arrived. That was wrong. Draven's hand went up, the silent military signal, and the group pulled up short before the gate, horses blowing hard from the ride, breath misting in the morning cold. The gate was open, and the keeper who should have been at the outer post was not at the outer post. Aldrich drew his sword without being told. Seraphine looked at the open gate and felt the second heartbeat surge once, hard, like a fist against the inside of her ribs. Something in there was already happening. Draven dismounted. The guards moved into defensive formation. She dismounted beside him, and he looked at her with a question in his face that was not whether she should come. They were past that, but how bad this was going to be. She looked at the open gate. Light was coming from inside, not the oil lamp light of a maintained archive. Silver light, cold and absolute, the same light she had seen in her window the night of the map room. "Bad," she said quietly. They went in. The Keeper Archive occupied the third level down, past 2 guard chambers that were both empty, past display cases of observational instruments that dated back further than written record. The silver light intensified as they descended, sourceless, coming from the walls themselves the way heat came from stone after a long day of sun. The head keeper was in the archive chamber. She was alive. Old woman, 70 at least, sitting against the far wall with a cut on her forehead that had bled down the side of her face and dried there, and she looked up when they entered with the expression of someone who had been waiting for rescue or death, and was only now determining which one had arrived. "The Chancellor's man was here," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that old people's voices were steady, not from lack of feeling, but from years of having practiced the steadiness regardless. 3 nights ago. He took the binding instrument. Draven crouched in front of her. What binding instrument? The mechanism used to disrupt the Covenant. We should have destroyed it. We kept it because it was documentation. Proof the method existed, not a tool to be used. We were wrong to keep it. She looked at her hands. He used it to drive the Blight into the Northern Covenant lines. It's been running for 3 months. Without the instrument, I cannot stop it manually. The only thing that can stop it now is a direct celestial intervention. Seraphine looked at the walls. The silver light was coming from the observational record, the physical record, 10,000 years of it, embedded in the stone of the archive the way rivers were embedded in landscape. She could see it clearly, not just as light, but as information, the way she had been able to read Old High Veirathi without knowing Old High Veirathi. The record was showing her the Blight's shape, the artificial introduction, the spreading lines, the fracture running through the Covenant like a crack in ice. And she could see the place where it was anchored, the place where Valor's instrument had made the initial break. It was here, under this building, in the deepest chamber of the abyss, where the Covenant's physical manifestation had existed for 10,000 years as a concentrated point of connection between the celestial structure above and the wolf bloodlines below. She walked to the archive wall and put her hand flat against the record, the way she had put her hand against the map room wall, and this time she did not hold anything back. The light came, not from her eyes this time, from her hands, her arms, spreading up through her body like an electrical charge finding its most efficient path, silver white and intensely cold and carrying inside it the pressure of something that had been compressed for 10,000 years into the approximate shape of a woman. She heard Draven say her name. She heard his footsteps moving toward her. She heard the headkeeper exhale, not in fear but in recognition, the sound of someone seeing something they had spent a lifetime knowing was theoretically possible and had never expected to witness. The archive walls lit up around her. Every observational record, every carved notation, every geometric mark in every surface, all of it responding to her contact the way a struck bell responded to the hammer, not because she commanded it, but because the resonance was right, because whatever lived in the space beneath her pulse was the original frequency that all of it had been calibrated to. She felt the Blight's anchor. She felt the fracture line. She felt the specific brutal simplicity of what needed to happen. And then Draven's hands closed on her shoulders from behind, and he turned her away from the wall, and she saw his face, close and fierce, and carrying everything he had never said in 4 years stacked on top of everything this moment required. "Tell me what you need," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of every professional register, just the man's voice with the man's urgency in it. "Tell me what I do." She looked at him. The silver light from the archive moved across his face. His hands were hard on her shoulders. His eyes were completely open, completely present, asking a question that had no precedent in any decision framework he had ever been given. She felt the second heartbeat and her own heartbeat running together in the same rhythm and understood what the archive records had been showing her. Not just the Blight, not just the fracture, the mechanism of the original celestial binding. Why the moon goddess had entered mortal flesh in the first place, 10,000 years ago. What the Covenant actually was, at its root, before it was written into ceremony and prophecy and sacrifice. It was not a transaction, it was a tether. And the tether was not between the moon and the Empire. It was between the moon and a specific bloodline. She looked at Draven, the last of that bloodline, the one whose ancestors had built their throne on the ruins of the old Empire, whose blood carried in it the original Covenant's anchor, and understood why she was here, in this body, in this court, bound to this man, not by accident, not by prophecy, by design 10,000 years old. "Hold on to me," she said. He tightened his grip on her shoulders. "Whatever happens," she said, "don't let go." She turned back to the wall. She pressed both palms against the record, and she opened the door. The light that came was not light that had a color in human vocabulary. The archive walls cracked. The floor shook. Somewhere above them, in the sky above the sacred abyss, the clouds broke open in a circle around a single point, and what was visible through that circle was not the expected stars. It was silver, all the way down. And in the palace of Veyrath, 140 miles north, Violor Thorn stood at the window of the council chamber where Aldrich's people had confined him, and watched the southern horizon erupt into light, and understood for the first time in 3 years of planning that he had made one mistake. He had been afraid of what would happen if she woke up. He had never considered what would happen if she woke up and had a reason to come back. His hands, folded behind him in the deliberate composure he had maintained across 3 administrations and 40 years of patient work, began, very slightly, to shake. The light did not end the world. It felt like it would. In the first seconds after Seraphine opened the door, the archive chamber became something that had no precedent in any living person's experience. Walls dissolving into pure silver luminescence, the floor vibrating at a frequency below sound, the air carrying a pressure that was not quite physical and not quite emotional, but occupied the same space as both. Draven's hands on her shoulders were the only fixed point in the room. He did not let go. She had asked him not to, and he had decided, in the way he made decisions that he could not have explained to a council but that had never been wrong, that this was the most important instruction he had ever been given. He held on. The Blight's anchor was in the deepest chamber, and she found it without moving physically. Found it the way you found a knot in a rope, by running your hands along the length, following the tension to its source. The fracture Valor's instrument had driven into the Covenant was not subtle. It was brutal, mechanical work, the kind of damage made by someone who understood the Covenant structure well enough to target its load-bearing points, and did not care what the breaking cost the people connected to it. She found the fracture. She put herself against it. What happened next was not something she would ever find adequate language for. The closest she could come, later, was this. It felt like being a door and a key simultaneously, like the thing she was carrying inside her had always been shaped specifically for this break, and the break had always been waiting for something shaped like her. The Covenant was not a system she was repairing from outside. She was part of its original architecture. The celestial awareness that had been sleeping in her for 10,000 years recognized the damage the way a body recognized an injury, not analytically, but completely, with the full weight of everything that should have been there and wasn't. She poured herself into the gap. Draven's hands tightened on her shoulders. She felt him brace his weight behind her like a man leaning into wind, and she understood that he could feel it too. Not the celestial mechanism, but her, the cost of what she was doing, the way you felt the temperature drop in a room before you understood why. The fracture sealed. Not slowly. All at once, the way a bone set rather than the way a wound healed. A single decisive moment of realignment that hurt with a clarity that left no room for anything else. And then it was done, and the Covenant was whole. And the Blight's anchor dissolved from the deepest chamber upward through the network of lines that connected the abyss to every wolf bloodline in the Empire, the frost retreating, the rivers clearing, 20 million lives exhaling something they hadn't known they were holding. The light went out. Not dramatically. It simply stopped, the way sound stopped when the source stopped, and the archive chamber was dark except for the oil lamps that had been burning all along, small and orange and very ordinary. And the floor was solid, and the walls were stone, and Draven was behind her with his hands on her shoulders and his forehead pressed against the back of her head, and his breathing was the breathing of a man who had been running very hard and had just stopped. She was on her knees. She didn't remember going to her knees. She put her hands flat on the archive floor and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed, taking inventory of what she was, what remained after the door had opened and closed again. She was still Seraphine Vale. She was also something else, something she did not have a clean name for yet. The way you didn't have a name for who you were on the other side of something that changed you until enough time had passed to see yourself from a distance. Both heartbeats were there. They were the same beat now. Seraphine. Draven's voice, close to her ear, stripped of everything except the fact of her name. "I'm here," she said. He pulled her up and turned her around and looked at her face in the lamplight with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment, and then whatever he found in her face made him pull her against him with the specific force of a man who had been preventing himself from doing that for 4 years, and had finally run out of reasons not to. She put her arms around him and held on. The headkeeper, still sitting against the far wall with dried blood on her face, looked at the two of them and said nothing, which was the most respectful thing she could have done. They rode back through the morning, slower this time. The horses were tired, and so were they, and the urgency had gone out of the road. Not the urgency of what was waiting at the palace, which was real and substantial, but the urgency of the thing that had been driving them forward for days, the sense of time collapsing toward a fixed point. That point had passed. Whatever came next was aftermath, and aftermath, in her experience, operated on its own schedule. The sky above the northern road was different than it had been on the ride south, cleaner. The particular quality of air after a long drought breaks, not just the absence of something wrong, but the presence of something right, a note that had been missing from the chord returning to its place. She rode beside Draven and watched the sky and thought about Valor. Not with rage. She had expected rage, and it hadn't come, which surprised her until she understood why. Rage was what you felt toward something that still had power over you. What she felt toward Valor was closer to the weight of having to deal with something that had caused a great deal of damage and now had to be reckoned with. The specific, exhausted clarity of someone who had been through the worst of a thing and was now on the other side of it, looking back. He had been afraid of what she was. He had built 3 years of meticulous, patient, genuinely intelligent work on the foundation of that fear, and the work had been real. The threat to the Empire had been real. The damage to the Covenant had been real. People had suffered. And it had still failed, because fear, however disciplined, however elaborately structured, was a foundation that cracked under weight. She had learned that in the archive, not from the text, from the Covenant's own memory. The old empire that had ended had been built by someone who understood the celestial power and had decided the correct response to it was containment. Put it in a body. Bind it in flesh. Call it a resource. Call it necessary. Tell a story about sacrifice and renewal that kept the power accessible and kept the power controlled. It had worked for a very long time. It had ended exactly as things built on control always ended. Not because the power broke free, but because control was a structure that required constant maintenance, and structures required maintenance eventually failed. And when they failed completely. The thing you were afraid of still existed. The thing you had been afraid of had, in her case, turned out to be a door, not a weapon. A mechanism of restoration. Something that had been put in a mortal body not to be contained but to be carried. Kept close to the world it was connected to. Kept warm by a human life until the world needed it again. She had not been a sacrifice. She had been a caretaker. The distinction felt important in a way she was still finding the edges of. Vialor was in the council chamber when they arrived. Still confined, still flanked by Aldrich's people. Still standing with his hands folded at the small of his back and his face arranged into the composure of a man who had decided that composure was the only territory left to him. He looked at them when they entered. At Draven first, then at her. And when he looked at her, the composure shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Something behind his eyes, doing the calculation it had apparently been doing since the previous night when the southern sky lit up. He understood the outcome. He had understood it before they walked in. The Covenant is restored, Draven said. Not a question. Yes, Valor said. His voice was even. I assumed it would be, given the light. The Abyss Keeper survived. Carveth has given testimony. The correspondence I could not find in my map room has been located in your private archive by Aldrich's people. Draven's voice was flat as a blade laid on a table. Do you dispute any of it? Valor looked at him for a moment. No, he said. The words sat in the room. Seraphine watched him. She watched the specific quality of a man at the end of a long game. Not the theatrical villain's collapse, nothing like that, because Vialor had never been theatrical. What she saw was something quieter, and in its own way more devastating. A person of genuine intelligence and genuine capability arriving at the conclusion that the intelligence and capability had been aimed wrong, and knowing it, and having no remaining argument against that knowledge. You were afraid, she said. His eyes moved to her. Everything you did, she said. The 3 years, the manufactured crisis, the coercion. It was all constructed around the premise that if I woke up, the world ended, the way it ended before. She held his gaze. You never considered that what ended the old empire was not the awakening. It was the containment that preceded it, the damage done by holding something in a shape it wasn't meant to hold. He looked at her for a long moment. I considered it, he said quietly. I decided the risk was too large. You decided your fear was too large, she said. They're not the same thing. The room was still. Valor said nothing. There was nothing left to say. And he was, above everything, a man who did not speak when he had nothing useful to offer. Draven looked at him for a long time. She knew what was happening in that look. The thing that happened to people who had trusted someone for years when the trust resolved into betrayal. The specific interior accounting of a man who was rereading every interaction across a long history with the new information active, finding all the places where the picture had been built wrong. He had trusted Valor for a decade. The men who were hardest to forgive were never the ones you'd known were dangerous. They were the ones you had believed were genuinely on your side, who had taken the position beside you in the room and used it with care and patience until the moment they didn't. Take him, Draven said to Aldrich. Aldrich did. Valor walked out between 2 guards without looking back, and the door closed, and Draven stood in the council chamber with his hands at his sides for a moment before he turned to face her. He looked like a man who had just put down something very heavy and was still feeling the absence of the weight. The council will want a trial, he said. Yes. The Empire will want a clear account of what happened. The blight, the conspiracy, all of it. He paused. They'll want to know about you. I know. He looked at her. What do I tell them? She thought about this carefully. Not about what was safe or politically manageable. She was done with that particular calculation. But about what was true, and whether the truth was something the Empire could receive. Tell them the Covenant is restored, she said. Tell them the blight was manufactured by a man who feared what he did not understand. Tell them the truth about Valor clearly and completely. She met his eyes. And tell them that their king's mate is not who they thought she was, and that she's staying anyway. Something moved in his face. Not the king's expression. That underneath thing, bare and specific and directed entirely at her. Seraphine, I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do. You're going to tell me that you announced my execution to 3,000 people, and you need to know whether that's the kind of thing that... I'm going to tell you, he said, that I have been making decisions in this empire for 15 years on the basis of what the empire required. And I have been very good at that. And for most of those 15 years, I convinced myself that what the empire required and what I needed were not in conflict. He crossed the room until he was in front of her. I know now that I was wrong. I know that the moment I stood in that throne room and said your name for that purpose, I was wrong, and I knew it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway, because I had been a king for so long I had forgotten there were things that being a king did not give you the right to. She looked at him. His voice had the quality it got when he had come down to the last layer of something, when the professional register had given out and what was left was just the grain of the man himself. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I'm telling you what I understand now, so that you know I understand it. What you do with that is yours. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the corridor after the throne room announcement, the 12 steps before she stopped walking, the wall at her back, the specific loneliness of having the ground shift beneath something you had believed was stable. She had not been performing composure in that moment. She had been finding it, the way you found footing on broken ground, not because the ground was good, but because standing was what was required. She had stood. She was still standing. You're going to make a different kind of mistake eventually, she said. Something else you decide you have the right to, that you don't. Probably, he said. And when you do, I'm going to tell you. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had built an empire on the bones of his certainties, and had just spent a week learning that certainty was a structure that required questioning from the outside to remain sound. Then we have an understanding, she said. The imperial court assembled 3 days later. Not the full formal regalia of the throne room announcement. She had specifically requested something different, and Draven had listened, which was itself a statement to everyone watching. The court gathered in the main hall, standing, no processional music, no ceremonial distance enforced between the ruling position and the people. Draven stood at the front of the hall. She stood beside him. He gave the account directly and completely. The blight, its artificial origin, Valor's 3-year construction of the crisis, Carveth's coercion and his testimony, the Abyss Keeper's account, the restoration of the Covenant. He did not make it elegant. He made it accurate. He gave the court the same information he had, in the same unvarnished form, and let them process it in real time rather than presenting them with a managed version designed to maintain a particular impression of him. There was a quality to the room when he finished that she had not heard before in this palace. Not the impressed silence of a court observing a powerful man performing authority. Something rawer and more valuable. The silence of people who had just been told the truth by someone who didn't have to tell it and were adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of that. Then he did the thing she had not asked him to do, which meant he had arrived at it himself. He turned to face her. He reached up and removed his crown. It was not a theatrical gesture. There was nothing of theater in how he did it. Just a man taking off a piece of heavy metal with both hands and holding it for a moment with the specific attention of someone who had worn a thing so long they needed to consciously feel its weight before they could put it down. Then he bent and placed it on the floor between them. Not at her feet, between them. The hall had gone absolutely still. This empire, he said, to her rather than to the court, was built on decisions I made alone. I'm done making it that way. She looked at him. She looked at the crown on the floor between them. She thought about the archive and the Covenant's memory, and the old empire that had been built on containment and had ended because containment was not the same as connection. She thought about the tether, not a chain, not a contract, but the thing the Covenant actually was at its root. Two things choosing to remain bound to each other across every force that tried to pull them apart. She picked up the crown. She turned it once in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the history in it. Then she placed it back on his head herself. She heard the court exhale. Together, she said. Just the one word. But she said it in a register that was not entirely human. The second heartbeat in her voice, the thing that had been sleeping for 10,000 years and was now simply awake, present, and permanent, and not going anywhere, carrying in it the memory of a covenant that had survived everything that had been thrown against it and was choosing, again, to hold. Draven held her gaze. His eyes were open and very still and full of something she finally had a name for. Not gratitude, not relief, recognition. The kind that came not from seeing something new, but from finally being seen clearly yourself, without the management and the armor and the careful architecture of a person who had spent years making sure no one got close enough to cost them anything. He had been seen. He had let himself be seen. That was the thing he had not understood 15 years ago when he started building an empire. That power was not the ability to never be vulnerable. Power was the ability to choose who saw you and to make that choice without fear. He had chosen. She had chosen. The court was silent around them, and neither of them noticed. In the weeks that followed, Veyrath rebuilt. The northern provinces received emergency relief from the imperial stores. The rivers ran clear. The wolves who had been losing their shifts found the connection restored overnight, the way you found that a room had been cold because a window was open, and not because warmth had left the world. A simple correction revealing that the fundamental thing had been intact all along. The crops that had died did not come back, but the ground received seed without the killing frost, and the planting that autumn was the most extensive in 20 years. Valor's trial lasted 11 days. It was fair, which was the hardest thing for an empire to manage. Fairness required acknowledging that a man who had done real damage was also a man, and that the damage had come from something as ordinary and terrible as fear. The council convicted him on 8 counts. He was stripped of his title and properties and confined to the northern border provinces for the remainder of his life, in a town that had been one of the first hit by the blight and had been one of the first to recover. She had suggested the location. Draven had understood why without asking. Carveth kept his position in the archive, under conditions he had himself proposed. Full transparency of methodology, all analysis peer-reviewed before submission to the council. A standing requirement that primary texts always be available for independent verification. He worked with the specific intensity of a man who had been given back something he thought he'd permanently damaged and was not going to waste the second chance. The head keeper of the sacred abyss sent a formal communication to the palace requesting that Lady Seraphine Vale, the title she retained, the human name she kept, the form she had inhabited for 30 years and chose to continue inhabiting, be recognized as a formal partner of the Keeper Order in the maintenance of the observational record. The communication used language that the palace scribes had to research to translate, the terminology so old it predated the Empire's founding documents. She accepted. She went to the abyss twice in the first year. Not for crisis, for maintenance, the way a skilled person returned regularly to work they had taken responsibility for, understanding that the difference between a structure that held and a structure that failed was often simply attention. Draven rode with her both times. Did. Late in the first year after the Blight's end, she stood in the western tower window in the early morning before the palace woke, the way she had stood the morning the crows came. No crows now. The sky was clear and the light was coming in from the east, and her tea was hot rather than cold, and there was no sense of something large moving through the world in a direction she couldn't see. Just morning, just the ordinary astonishment of a day beginning. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, the compressed cadence she had learned years ago as something that belonged to this building, this court, this particular version of her life. And the door opened. Draven came in, already dressed, carrying his own cup of something that wasn't tea and never was, and stood beside her at the window. He looked at the sky. She looked at the sky. The Thornwood harvest report came, he said. Good? Better than the last 7 years combined. She looked at the light on the eastern horizon and felt the two heartbeats, one entirely hers, one carrying in it the memory of 10,000 years, running steady and together in the morning quiet. She had not been remade by what happened in the abyss. She had been revealed. The woman who had stood in corridors watching rooms and keeping her observations behind her eyes, the woman who had walked the length of a throne room toward her own announced death without breaking stride. The woman who had put her hand against a map room wall in the dark and felt the pulse of something ancient beneath her palm. That woman had always been this. The celestial awareness was not an addition to who she was. It was what she had always been, carried in a form that made it possible to exist in a world that had forgotten how to receive it. The world was remembering. That was enough. Draven, she said. Yes. The empire you built. You know it's different now. He was quiet for a moment. I know. The 7 kingdoms stayed because they were afraid. They'll stay now for other reasons, or they won't stay. She looked at him. That's going to require a different way of being a king than the one you learned. He looked back at her. His face was the face she had come to know in 4 years, and had now come to know differently, past the armor, past the king's distance, into the terrain of who he was when the performance of strength was no longer necessary because the actual thing was present without it. I know that too, he said. Are you afraid of it? He considered this honestly, which was the thing he had learned to do more often. Consider questions honestly, rather than immediately from the position of what the answer should be. Yes, he said. Good, she said. He looked at her. Afraid is right, she said. Afraid means you understand the weight of it. Afraid is what keeps the decisions honest. She turned back to the window. It's the men who stop being afraid that get it wrong. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You are genuinely the most difficult person in this empire. I know, she said. I mean that specifically as a compliment. I know that too. The light came fully over the eastern ridge and filled the room. Outside, the palace was beginning to wake. Below in the courtyard, she could hear the first sounds of the day. The duty guard changing, the kitchen fires being started, the horses in the lower stable moving in their stalls. The empire breathing, ordinary and alive, 20 million people going about the specific urgent business of their lives without knowing that anything had changed in the deep structure of the world that held them. They didn't need to know. The covenant held. That was what mattered. She finished her tea and set the cup down and looked at her own hands for a moment. The faint mark on her left wrist where the bruise had been, long healed, and beneath that, just barely visible in the morning light, the ghost of a moon sigil that had never fully faded. Permanent now. Hers. She turned from the window and walked toward the door and the day and everything it required. Behind her, Draven Voss, Alpha King, last of his bloodline, the most feared ruler in living memory, watched the woman who had come back from the altar he had built for her and understood, with the total clarity of a man who had finally stopped managing his understanding, that there was nothing in the 7 kingdoms he had taken by force that compared to what he had been given by choosing, once, to let something stronger than his own will decide the shape of things. The empire was not saved by prophecy. It was saved by 2 people who chose, in the worst moment, to face the same direction. That was the whole of it. That was enough.